The tension hit like a gut punch. The moment Jack Sullivan lowered himself into his first-class seat, he felt the weight of eyes on him. It wasn't the usual curious glances. No, this was different. A subtle, lingering scrutiny. He exhaled, adjusted his cuffs, and reached for his phone. A long flight from LAX to New York. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then came the sharp, clipped voice from above. "Excuse me, sir, I need to see your ticket." Jack looked up. A flight attendant, mid-40s, blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, uniform crisp but stiff, stood with arms crossed. Her badge read, L. Brooks. The expression on her face wasn't welcoming. It was the kind of look someone gives when they've already decided they're right. He reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and handed her the ticket without hesitation. She snatched it, her eyes scanning the details, a frown, a tightening of her jaw. "This doesn't look correct," she said flatly. Jack stayed calm. "It's my seat." Brooks barely acknowledged his words. Instead, she pursed her lips and turned, marching toward the front of the plane. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A man across the aisle raised an eyebrow. Jack exhaled and leaned back, but his gut told him this wasn't over. He glanced toward the galley where Brooks was now speaking to another flight attendant, her voice low but sharp. She turned back, her posture even stiffer. "Sir, I checked. There seems to be an issue. You'll need to move to economy." Jack blinked once, then twice. "There's no issue," he said evenly. "You just checked. That's my seat." Her nostrils flared. The air around them felt thick, charged. Someone a few rows back murmured, but no one outright interfered, not yet. "You need to move, sir," she repeated, this time with the kind of forced patience one uses on a stubborn child. Jack didn't raise his voice, didn't shift his posture. He simply set his ticket on the armrest, folded his hands over his lap, and looked her dead in the eye. "I'm staying right here." A ripple of whispers. The older woman in the window seat beside him shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether to get involved. Across the aisle, a young man, probably in his late 20s, casually lifted his phone. A small red dot blinked on the screen. "Recording," Brooks noticed, her lips pressed into a thin line, the kind that barely concealed frustration. She turned on her heel and stalked off toward the galley. The hum of the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Jack exhaled slowly. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he wasn't about to be bullied either. This wasn't his first flight, and he knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't about the ticket. It wasn't about an issue. It was about perception, and the moment she decided he didn't belong. Jack could feel the energy in the cabin shift. Conversations became hushed, movements more cautious. He wasn't the only one who sensed it. A few rows ahead, a man in a navy blazer adjusted his posture, his eyes flicking between Jack and the galley. Brooks returned faster than expected, her heels clicking against the aisle floor. This time, she wasn't alone. A senior flight attendant trailed behind her, tall, late 50s, salt and pepper hair, the kind of guy who looked like he'd seen it all. His name tag read D. Harris. His expression was measured, but his presence alone told Jack one thing. She'd escalated the situation. Harris stopped beside Brooks, who stood rigid, arms still crossed. "Sir, my colleague tells me there's an issue with your seating assignment," Harris said, his voice steady. Jack kept his posture relaxed but firm. He gestured toward his ticket, still resting on the armrest. "No issue," he said. "That's my seat." Harris glanced at the ticket, pulled out a small tablet, and tapped a few times. The screen glowed as he scanned the manifest. Jack watched his expression carefully. A furrowed brow, a flicker of hesitation, then just as quickly a nod. "This is his seat," Harris confirmed. For a moment, the tension seemed to break, a small victory. Jack expected Brooks to back off, maybe offer a forced apology before moving on. Instead, her jaw clenched. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice tight. Harris's gaze snapped toward her, his patience thinning. "I'm sure," he said. The air between them crackled. Brooks' grip on her notepad tightened. Jack didn't miss the way her fingers curled around it, the white of her knuckles barely visible beneath her skin. "I don't understand," she muttered, almost to herself. "I checked." The woman next to Jack shifted in her seat. Across the aisle, the young man recording hadn't lowered his phone. In fact, his grip seemed steadier now. Harris exhaled sharply. "Let's get back to final preparations," he said. His voice carried the weight of authority, a quiet command that wasn't up for discussion. But Brooks didn't move. Jack held her gaze, waiting. She wasn't looking at the ticket or Harris or even the passengers who were now actively watching. She was looking at him, not just seeing him, evaluating him. Jack had been here before, not in this exact seat, Not on this exact flight, but in moments just like this. The kind where reason didn't matter, where facts didn't change anything. The kind where someone had already made up their mind. Brooks took a slow breath. "All right," she finally said. The word sat heavy in the air, unwilling, like it had been forced out of her throat. Jack didn't move, didn't gloat, just nodded once and reached for his book. Brooks turned sharply, stalking toward the galley. Harris followed, his posture tense. Jack didn't watch them go. He didn't need to, because whatever was happening wasn't over yet. Jack flipped open his book, but his eyes didn't move across the page. He could still feel the weight of what had just happened, the tension thick enough to cut. Around him, passengers settled back into their seats, but the energy in the cabin remained charged. The man across the aisle, still holding his phone, gave Jack a small nod. Not quite approval, not quite sympathy, something in between. The hum of quiet conversation returned, but it wasn't the same. People were whispering now, their voices careful, their glances quick. Jack wasn't the only one who knew this wasn't over. Then the faint rustle of movement from the galley. Brooks. She stood just outside the curtain, gripping a clipboard so tightly her fingers had turned pale. She wasn't looking at Jack this time. She was watching Harris, who was speaking in hushed tones with another attendant. Whatever was being said, she wasn't happy about it. Jack didn't react. He'd played this game before. He knew better than to give her any reason to make this worse. But Brooks didn't need a reason. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and strode back down the aisle. She didn't stop next to Jack this time. She went further, stopping near the row behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice just loud enough to carry, but not enough to sound like she was making an official statement. "If you experience any issues during the flight, please let us know immediately. Our priority is ensuring that all passengers are comfortable and in their proper seats." Jack felt the words land, felt the way she carefully avoided looking at him, how she made sure the sentence had just enough weight to suggest something without outright saying it. The woman next to him stiffened. The man across the aisle scoffed. Jack just closed his book. A few seats ahead, someone murmured, "What was that about?" Brooks didn't linger. She turned, disappearing back into the galley as if she hadn't just tossed gasoline onto a simmering fire. Jack exhaled slowly. It was a move he recognized, something just subtle enough to plant doubt in the minds of those around him. She couldn't force him out of his seat, couldn't call security over nothing. But she could make people wonder, and in some ways, that was worse. The flight crew moved through the final checks, the usual bustle of departure resuming. The plane taxied to the runway, and for a few moments, it almost felt like things might settle. But Jack knew better. Some people just couldn't let things go. The plane lifted off, engines roaring as it climbed into the sky. Jack stared out the window, watching the city shrink below, but his thoughts were still anchored inside the cabin. He could feel it. The tension hadn't disappeared. It had just gone quiet. The worst kind of quiet. The kind that made you feel like something was creeping just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. He wasn't wrong. 15 minutes into the flight, Brooks reappeared. She wasn't carrying anything. No drink tray, no clipboard. Just a forced expression of professionalism that didn't quite reach her eyes. She stopped at Jack's row, close enough that he had no choice but to acknowledge her. "Sir," she said, voice perfectly controlled, "I'd like to remind you that our first-class passengers are expected to follow all flight policies to ensure a smooth experience for everyone." Jack blinked. He hadn't moved since takeoff, hadn't spoken to anyone. He'd barely turned a page in his book. He met her gaze, steady. "Did I break a rule?" A flicker of irritation crossed her face before she forced it down. "Not yet." The words hung in the air, a warning. Jack didn't respond, didn't rise to the bait. He could feel passengers watching, their curiosity sharper this time. A few rows ahead, the man in the navy blazer shifted uncomfortably. The woman next to Jack pressed her lips into a thin line, glancing between them. Then from across the aisle, the quiet voice of the man with the phone. "Ma'am, is there a reason you keep bothering him?" Brooks turned sharply. For the first time, she looked rattled. "This doesn't concern you, sir," she snapped. The man tilted his head. "Kinda does, though. We all saw what happened, and now you're standing here acting like you're waiting for him to mess up." A ripple of murmurs followed. Jack stayed silent. He didn't need to say anything. The shift was happening on its own. Brooks' face reddened. She hesitated, then turned on her heel, storming back toward the galley. The man across the aisle let out a low chuckle. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head. Some people just don't know when to quit. Jack exhaled, tension still coiled in his chest. No, she wasn't quitting. She was just getting started. Jack could hear the hushed murmurs from a few rows back. The shift had happened. The passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were choosing sides. He could feel it in the way their eyes tracked Brooks as she disappeared behind the galley curtain. The man across the aisle set his phone down, stretching his legs. "You know," he said casually, "I've seen people get kicked off flights for a lot less. Usually it's because they're actually causing a problem." Jack smirked slightly but didn't engage. He wasn't here to win points with the crowd. He just wanted to be left alone. A flight attendant, someone younger, new, peeked out from the galley. She hesitated before stepping forward, her voice careful. "Sir, can I get you anything?" Jack studied her. She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure whether approaching him was the right move. He gave her an easy nod. "Just water, thanks." She nodded quickly and hurried off, clearly relieved that he wasn't going to make this difficult. Brooks reappeared a moment later, moving with purpose. She didn't look at Jack this time. Instead, she strode past him and leaned toward an older couple a few rows ahead. "Apologies for any disruptions," she said, just loud enough for people nearby to hear. "We're doing our best to ensure a comfortable flight for everyone." Jack sighed inwardly. He knew exactly what she was doing, planting seeds. The older woman gave her a confused look. "Oh, we're fine," she said. Brooks smiled tightly and moved on, repeating the same line to another passenger. This time, the reaction was different. A man in a business suit frowned slightly, shifting his gaze toward Jack, as if suddenly considering something he hadn't before. Jack didn't react. He wasn't going to play into whatever game she was trying to start, but then the intercom clicked on, and the captain's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're cruising at 35,000 feet. We appreciate your cooperation as our crew ensures a smooth flight. If you need any assistance, don't hesitate to ask." A standard announcement, except it wasn't. Because Jack caught the way Brooks subtly glanced toward the galley right as the captain spoke, like she had been waiting for it, like she had already made another call. This wasn't over. It was about to escalate. Jack had been in enough high-pressure situations to recognize when something was shifting. The moment the captain's voice faded from the intercom, he knew Brooks wasn't backing down. She was regrouping. He could see it in the way she hovered near the galley, stealing quick glances at him while pretending to adjust a tray. She was waiting. For what? He wasn't sure yet. The younger flight attendant returned with his water, setting it down with a hesitant smile before slipping away, clearly not wanting to get caught in whatever battle was brewing. Jack took a slow sip, keeping his breathing even. He wasn't about to make this easy for her. Then, movement. Brooks reemerged, this time with Harris, the senior flight attendant, walking beside her. Unlike before, she wasn't scowling. Instead, she had carefully arranged her face into something more neutral, professional. Harris stopped beside Jack's seat, nodding politely. "Sir, I'd like to check in with you. Are you comfortable? Is everything all right?" Jack studied him. The tone was too polished, too measured. "I'm fine," he said simply. Harris nodded again, but something about it felt rehearsed, like he was following a script. "We want to make sure all our passengers are enjoying their flight," Harris continued, voice smooth. "That includes you, of course, but also those around you." Jack exhaled through his nose. There it was, the setup. This wasn't about checking in. This was about framing the narrative, making it seem like he was the disruption, not Brooks. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. He could feel eyes on him, feel the tension curling in the air like a storm about to break. "That's good to hear," Jack said, voice even. "I haven't caused any issues, so I don't think we'll have a problem." A flicker of something crossed Harris's face, a tiny hesitation. Brooks, standing stiffly beside him, wasn't as subtle. Her jaw clenched. Jack didn't move, didn't react. He let the silence do the work for him. Finally, Harris cleared his throat. "Of course, we just wanted to check in." Then, just like that, he turned and walked away. Brooks lingered for half a second longer, eyes sharp with something unspoken. Then she followed. Jack exhaled slowly. That hadn't been a warning. That had been a test, and he had a sinking feeling it wouldn't be the last. Jack kept his posture relaxed, but inside he could feel the pressure building. The situation had reached a tipping point. Brooks had tried subtlety, then passive aggression, and now she was using authority figures to frame him as the problem. She wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore. She was trying to manipulate the entire cabin into seeing him as the disruption. And Harris? He wasn't here to fix anything. He was here to give her cover, Jack had seen this play out before, not on a plane maybe, but in boardrooms, negotiations, and plenty of situations where people thought power alone would get them what they wanted. But power meant nothing when it was built on a lie. The man across the aisle, the one who had been recording earlier, leaned in slightly. "They're trying to push you," he muttered, just low enough that only Jack could hear. "They want you to snap." Jack nodded subtly. He wasn't going to give them what they wanted. Meanwhile, Brooks had retreated to the galley again. This time, she wasn't pacing. She was talking. Her voice was low but urgent. Jack couldn't make out the words, but he could see the younger flight attendant nodding hesitantly, glancing toward him before quickly looking away. She was uncomfortable. She knew this was wrong. Then the intercom clicked again. But this time, it wasn't the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brooks' voice came through, smooth but deliberate. "We appreciate your cooperation during this flight. Please remember that our priority is the comfort and safety of all passengers." Jack's fingers curled around the armrest. It was vague, nonspecific, but it was meant for him. The energy in the cabin shifted again. Some passengers frowned, confused. Others whispered. The older couple up front exchanged glances, their expressions uncertain. It was working. Jack had to tread carefully now. Across the aisle, the man with the phone was still recording. His expression had shifted from mild curiosity to something sharper. He wasn't just watching. He was documenting. Jack exhaled, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I don't think I've done anything that affects anyone's comfort." The words weren't loud, but they carried, enough for those around him to hear. A pause, a flicker of hesitation from a few passengers, and just like that, the pendulum started swinging back. Brooks had played her move. Now she had to live with it. Jack knew the moment Brooks made that announcement, she had overplayed her hand. The tension in the cabin had been building, but now it was different. Now, it wasn't just about him. She had involved everyone, and that meant the passengers had a choice, to stay quiet or to push back. The man across the aisle, still recording, let out a low chuckle. "Wow," he muttered. "She really thinks she can get away with this?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to, because something was about to shift. A few rows ahead, an older woman, maybe mid-60s, silver hair styled neatly, dressed in a light blue blouse, turned in her seat. Her voice was gentle but clear. "Young man," she said, looking at Jack, "I've been flying for 40 years and I've never seen someone get harassed this much for sitting in their assigned seat." A murmur spread through the cabin, small but growing. Brooks reappeared, but this time, there was something different in her stance. The confidence, the control, it was slipping. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, another voice cut through the cabin. "Excuse me!" It was the man with the phone. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear. He turned his screen outward, showing the recording. "I just want to be clear. If anything happens after this flight, we all saw what really went down. And now, so will the rest of the world." A silence fell over the cabin. Brooks hesitated. And in that hesitation, Jack saw it. Realization. Not just that she had lost, but that there was no way out of this without consequences. She stiffened, her jaw clenching. Then, without a word, she turned sharply on her heel and disappeared into the galley. Jack exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his chest ease for the first time. He wasn't the one who ended this fight. The passengers had. Harris returned a few minutes later, but his energy had changed. He looked resigned, defeated. He stopped by Jack's row, rubbing a hand over his jaw before speaking low. "Sir, on behalf of the airline, I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience." His voice was measured, careful. "Please enjoy the rest of your flight." Jack just nodded. He wasn't here for an apology. He was here to remind people that sometimes doing nothing is just as loud as taking a stand. As the plane continued toward its destination, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations resumed, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop. Then, just as Jack turned back to his book, the older woman ahead of him glanced back one last time, and with a small, knowing smile, she whispered, "Good for you." Jack smiled back, because for once the right thing had actually won.